For 40 years, Frank Glazer lived a life that would kill most men in days. He crossed freezing rivers alone, out-tracked native hunters, shot wolves for the government but respected them more than most humans, and called a dirt-floored cabin home for 13 brutal winters. He walked the line between hunter and naturalist, killer and caretaker, myth and man. Here's what life was really like for Alaska's most fearless mountain man you've never heard of. Before we start, if these stories help you sleep, hit subscribe so you don't miss any. Comment where you're at and the time too. Kind of fun seeing all the different places. Someone from Iceland commented once and I had to Google what time zone that even is. Okay, tonight we're heading to Alaska in 1915, but before we go anywhere, get cozy. Like, actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You wake up to pitch darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. Your breath clouds in front of your face, visible even in the dim light. It's so cold your nose hairs have frozen, not like the gentle chill that has you reaching for an extra blanket. We're talking about the kind of cold that kills. This is Alaska, 1915, and right now you're Frank Glazer. 26 years old, single, done with normal life. A few hours ago, you walked out of Washington State with 2 duffels, a .306 Winchester rifle, binoculars, and what the locals might call a hunger for chaos. You've just stepped off the SS Mariposa onto Alaskan soil, and what greets you isn't a welcome committee. It's 25 feet of snow in Thompson Pass. You'll never make it, someone tells you. 3 men died trying to reach Fairbanks last month. You just adjust your pack straps and keep walking. See, the thing about Frank Glazer that made him different, he wasn't running to something. He wasn't chasing gold or glory like everyone else flooding into Alaska back then. He was just done. Done with whatever passed for civilization back in Washington. Done with people, probably. I came to Alaska looking for game, he'd say years later. What I found was something wilder. What he found was a 371-mile death march to Fairbanks. I'm serious. That's what it was. No roads, no trains, just a crude trail through what locals described as part sludge pit, part ice trap, part murder alley, and Frank walked right into it without blinking. The locals in Valdez didn't sugarcoat it. Too much snow in the pass, they warned, and rivers got no bridges. 2 men got killed in Copper Center last fall. You know what most people would do hearing that? Turn around, get back on the boat, tell everyone back home, yeah, I tried Alaska, wasn't for me, not Frank. Instead, he finds an old sourdough. That's what they called the experienced pioneers, the ones who'd survived at least one winter, and convinces the guy to be his trail partner. Frank shoves his supplies into a rucksack and they hit the trail. The rest of the newcomers, the soft city chichacos as the locals called them, were hauling way too much gear and wearing what might as well have been dress shoes. Once they hit waist-deep snow, they broke. Feet sore, packs soaked, spirits crushed. Picture this, you're knee-deep in snow that sometimes goes up to your waist. Your boots are soaked through, your toes are numb, then painful, then numb again, which is worse because that's when frostbite sets in. One guy named Knockout Solomon, and I'm not making that up, was cursing non-stop because his fancy high-end boots basically chewed his feet into raw meat. Should have gone with moose hide, the sourdough probably told him. Too late now, but Frank just kept walking. I've been outdoors, I've hiked, I've camped, but this was a different universe of hardship. The nights were brutal. The snow would crust just enough to make you think it was solid, then cave in without warning. You'd plunge waist deep, have to claw your way out, then take 2 more steps and repeat the whole process. You'll never make it unless it crusts again tonight, the owner of Ptarmigan Drop Roadhouse told them. Frank didn't wait. Waiting meant frostbite or worse. The thing about Alaska that I don't think we can even comprehend today is the rivers. Today we've got bridges, right? Highways, GPS. Back then, you'd hit a river and there'd be nothing. No bridge, no boat, just an icy torrent cutting through your path. So what do? Well, if you're Frank Glazer in 1915, the answer is simple and also completely insane. You strip naked. Yeah. In temperatures that could freeze spit before it hits the ground, you take off your clothes, you bundle them up with your gear to keep them dry, then you wade through a river so cold it feels like your skin is being sliced open with every step. One time, Frank actually soaked his bleeding feet in the freezing water, then dried them, pulled on fresh socks, and kept moving. That toughened me up, he said later, like it was nothing, like stepping into ice water with open wounds was just a normal Tuesday. I'd have quit right there, would have been like, you know what, Washington State wasn't so bad. The roadhouses came every 20 miles or so. Some were open, some were boarded up tight. At Upper Tonsina, Frank got a bed and immediately regretted it. His trail partner took one look at him the next day and said, "You're lousy, Glazer. Should have checked the bed." Lousy as in covered in lice. After that, Frank chose stars over sheets. Decided he'd rather freeze than itch. That sourdough partner eventually peeled off to work a mine, and so Frank went solo, that's right, alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, without GPS or cell phones or Gore-Tex or any of the high-tech gear we'd consider essential today. He slept by day and hiked by night, constantly scanning for game, for shelter, for anything that seemed off. He'd developed this sixth sense already, something that would define him for the next 4 decades, an awareness of everything around him, a way of reading the wild like it was sending him signals no one else could hear. At Copper Center, he developed what locals called musher's knee, this deep, grinding ache from dragging 60 pounds through mud and snow. The local fix? Stand in an icy stream until your legs go numb, dry off, keep going. I mean, the medical care back then was basically just various forms of torture that sometimes accidentally helped. And this remedy, it sounds insane, but it actually worked. The cold reduced inflammation, numbed the pain. People who live in extreme environments develop extreme solutions. You know what's interesting about that trail? A historian once told me? It didn't just test your body, it messed with your head. Copper Center had stories that would follow Frank. There, the McRaes bred silver and black foxes worth a fortune. Frank learned quick that if you mess with a nesting vixen, she'll kill her own pups rather than let them be taken. He also heard about a triple murder from the previous fall. One guy's arm turned up in a sled dog's mouth, another had 7.22 bullets in his back. Picture yourself there. You're alone in the wilderness, it's getting dark, and you've just heard about dismembered bodies being found in this exact area. Plus, now the snow is turning to bog, which means mosquitoes. Not the annoying kind we deal with in summer. We're talking swarms so thick they could block out the sun. They hit like they'd been starving for weeks. Frank picked up a bed net at a trading post. Might have been the smartest thing he ever bought, an old-timer told me. In Galkana, he passed a signal corps shack where a lynx lounged on the desk and rode stray dogs like ponies. Tame Dal sheep climbed haylofts, foxes twitched in wire cages, marten farms bloomed in the mud. It's like the wild and civilization blurred into one weird mess. That's Alaska for you. Places where the rules we take for granted just don't apply. Then came sourdough, not a person, a roadhouse, and not just any roadhouse. This one was run by swearing Molly, 6'2", sharp-tongued, didn't take crap from anyone. She cursed like a dock worker and cooked like a chef. When Frank showed up, she was mid-rant, chasing some poor guy out with a storm of insults. Then she looked at Frank like nothing had happened and said, "You hungry? Come in, have some coffee." Her place was spotless. Carpeted floors, curtained windows, warm fire. It was a magnet for traders, trappers, drifters, anyone with a story or scars. Molly ran the joint like a queen. Once she got sweet on a driver named Jack Bishop. He mailed her a fake gold nugget made of salt. She showed it off all summer, thought she'd struck it rich. When the truth came out, she vowed revenge, then forgave him by spring. That was Molly, fire and grace wrapped up in boots. When Frank left, the ground got worse. Spruce log roads turned to deep, sucking mud. The trail climbed again past Paxton Lake, past Summit Lake, both frozen solid in May. Somewhere along the ice, Frank met Bobby Sheldon, the first guy to drive from Fairbanks to Valdez. He was hacking at ice, trying to drag a busted Model T across it. Frank jumped in, swinging tools for hours. Bobby was a real pioneer, Frank would say later, almost with admiration, which wasn't something he gave out easily. A miner named Matt McGovern, 52, joined Frank for a stretch. Decent guy until he almost shot Frank while fiddling with a pistol. Then McGovern remembered he'd left $400 in a vest back at Paxton's, about $11,000 in today's money. The guy turned around, ran all the way back and came grinning with the cash like it was no big deal. These people weren't normal, none of them, including Frank. They timed river crossings for noon before meltwater swelled from the day's sun. Midnight hits and those rivers will kill you, Frank said. One wrong step and you're gone. He saw it happen later. Sheldon lost a whole Model T to a river and spent weeks pretending to pan gold out of the wreck. I guess when you lose everything, you either break down or make jokes. At Yost's Roadhouse, things turned gloomy. 12 people had frozen to death there one winter. Blizzards blinded travellers just yards from the door. The army had put up a fence and a bell that clanged in the wind, hoping it might save the next poor soul who got caught out there. Frank also heard about stagecoach passengers dumped in a whiteout, crawling blind in the snow while a signal corps sergeant dragged them in one at a time. And past Yost's, the wild bit back. Grizzly tracks the size of snowshoes crossed the trail. Frank always kept his rifle loaded and close. Snowshoe hares bolted like sparks, tearing bark off willows like locusts. The rhythm out there was simple. Eat, freeze, survive, repeat. By the time Frank limped into Fairbanks, he was wrecked. Scarred from lice, feet shredded, eyes hollow. He'd walked nearly 400 miles through some of the nastiest terrain on the continent. Broke, beat up, tough as rawhide, but he'd made it. He was home, nobody there to greet him. No parade, no handshake, no welcome to Fairbanks banner. Just a raw frontier town full of people either chasing fortune or running from something. Frank wasn't doing either. He was just looking for a place where he could be alone with the wild, a place that would test him every day, a place where survival wasn't taken for granted. He found it, and in doing so, he found himself. You lie in your bed. Unlike Frank, who slept on frozen ground or in lousy roadhouses, you pull your blanket tighter, grateful for walls that keep out the wind, for running water that isn't a freezing river you have to cross naked, for the simple luxury of being warm, of being safe. And as you drift, you wonder, what would make a man choose that life? What was Frank Glazer running from? Or maybe, what was he running toward? This was just the beginning. Frank Glazer's Alaskan adventure had only just begun, and the wild was waiting to test him in ways he couldn't imagine. The wolves hadn't even entered his story yet, but they would, soon enough. Frank Glazer didn't hunt for sport. He hunted to eat, to survive, to make a dollar. In Alaska, meat was currency, and currency meant staying alive. Frank limped into Fairbanks with feet torn to shreds, his body battered from the journey, but his eyes, they were scanning the horizon already. He saw nothing but wild country stretched in every direction and went straight to work. From 1915 to 1924, Frank was what they called a market hunter. In those days, before supermarkets and refrigerated trucks, the people in frontier towns like Fairbanks needed meat. Miners, traders, roadhouse operators, they all had money, but they didn't have the time or skills to hunt. That's where men like Frank came in. He scouted the Alaska Range, picked his grounds, and got busy. The rhythm was simple: shoot, butcher, haul, sell, repeat. You're probably thinking, wait, he just walked 371 miles through hell and now he's going hunting? Yeah, that's exactly what he did. No rest, no recovery time. The wilderness doesn't give you a break just because you're tired. Frank moved through the slopes near the Valdez Trail like a shadow. Caribou, Dall sheep, moose. He tracked them through silence, through storms, knew their patterns like a map burned into his head. He carried that .306 Winchester like it was part of his arm. When Frank raised that rifle, one guy said years later, something dropped every time. He packed light when he hunted. Just the rifle, some ammunition, basic supplies. He'd disappear into the backcountry for days at a time. No radio, no backup, just Frank and whatever animal he was tracking. When he returned to civilization, he hauled hundreds of pounds of meat, sometimes dragging it through snow on a makeshift sled, sometimes packing it over ridgeline trails on his back. He sold it for 25 cents a pound. That's about $7 in today's money. There was no show to it, no ego, just blood, cold, and the math of survival. "How do you know where to find that moose?" someone once asked him. Frank just shrugged. "You listen to what the land's telling you." One time he dropped a moose cow deep in the woods, miles from anywhere. Most hunters would have taken the choice cuts and left the rest. Not Frank. He hauled the meat out solo, load by load, over 3 days, slept under spruce boughs when skies were clear, huddled by warm rocks when they weren't. No partner, no backup. "I got used to it," he said later. "Didn't need anybody. I had the animals." Game was thick in Alaska back then, and surprisingly fearless. Animals hadn't learned to fear humans yet. There just weren't enough people around. He once spotted Dall sheep across a canyon. They didn't see him. He belly crawled a mile through frozen brush. Picked one, dropped it. Then skinned it in the snow and packed it home. For Frank, there was no thrill in the kill. Just meat, money, and calculating how long it would last. You have to understand, market hunting wasn't a job, it was survival. There were no roads, no shortcuts, just rough trails, steep climbs, deep creeks, 1 minute sun, next minute blizzard. The weather turns on you up there, an old-timer told me once. No warning, blue sky can go white in 10 minutes, then you're in trouble. Once, a storm pinned Frank down for 3 days. He crawled under spruce boughs, a moose carcass just yards away. The wind howled like a banshee. That's not just a saying, that's actually what it sounds like when wind cuts through black spruce at 40 below. Frank curled up in his sleeping bag and hoped the bears didn't smell the meat. "Too cold to worry," he said later. "Too cold to move." Food ran thin often. He shot ptarmigan when he could find them, those Arctic grouse that turn white in winter. When game was scarce, he boiled bones and scraps, dug roots, picked bulbs, ate whatever the land offered. "I didn't waste nothing," he said. "If I killed it, I used it." Unlike trophy hunters, Frank didn't care about antlers unless they meant extra cash. "I never shot cows if I could help it," he said. Same with ewes. Took bulls, took rams, left the breeders. He didn't do this out of some ethical stance or conservation mindset. It was pure logic. If you kill the breeding females, there won't be any game next year. And if there's no game, you starve. Frank hunted where the ground tried to kill you. Loose rock, ice-covered logs, steep slopes, places where a twisted ankle meant death. Rivers like the Delta and Little Tock weren't just cold, they were deadly. In spring, they rose fast, fed by snowmelt. One crossing, he lost half a moose when his pack slipped. Meat gone. Damn shame, he said. That was good meat. His rifle was part of him. Even in his 60s, he wore no glasses. He could spot fur on a ridge at distances that made other hunters squint. The gun was always loaded, always within reach, not just for hunting, for protection. If you've never been in bear country, you can't understand what it means to be prey. In most of our modern lives, we're at the top of the food chain. We don't think about being eaten, but in Alaska, especially back then, you were just another animal. And often you weren't the biggest or the strongest. The winters were dead quiet. Snow muffled every sound. Wind whispered through trees. Frank went weeks without hearing a human voice. I never got lonesome, he told a writer named Jim Reardon years later. I had my rifle, I had work to do. He packed meat to roadhouses and camps, anywhere that paid. A quarter a pound mattered when you had nothing. I could pack 100 pounds easy, Frank said. Did it all the time. His journal entries from those years don't ramble, just facts, clipped and direct. Shot 2 moose, packed 1 down. Too much snow for dogs. Slept rough. Snowed all night. Another entry. Wind bad. Nearly lost sled. Killed 1 caribou. Feet froze. There was no room for mistakes. Twist a knee. You're stuck. No food. You starve. Break an ankle. You die. But Frank didn't slow down. He kept moving, tracking, hauling, hustling meat through deep snow and dead silence just to earn a buck. No rangers, no safety net, just you, your rifle, and whatever you could carry out. You're lying in your warm bed right now, maybe sipping something hot, comfortable, safe. Frank went years without any of that. Years where each day was a fight to survive, where comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. You know what really stands out about Frank during these years? He was alone, completely alone, but he wasn't running from people. He wasn't some misanthrope who hated humanity. He just preferred the quiet, the simplicity of survival, the honest transaction between him and the wild. People complicate things, he said once. Animals are straight with you. They're trying to live, same as you. No lies, no games. The hunting was hard physical labour, but it suited him. Up before dawn most days, moving through forest and tundra in silence, reading tracks, watching wind direction, checking snow conditions. Frank spoke the wild's language, moved through it like he belonged. "Game's smarter than you think," he said once. "You got to outthink it, outwalk it, outfreeze it if that's what it takes." The Alaska Range, where Frank did most of his hunting, is brutal country. Peaks jutting up to 13,000 feet, valleys so deep they don't see sun for months in winter, glaciers that can swallow you whole if you step wrong. Frank knew every ridge, every pass. He learned the terrain inch by inch, paid for that knowledge with frozen fingers and hungry nights. He had a map in his head, said Oscar Vogel, who knew him later, more detailed than anything on paper. Most market hunters worked in pairs at least, sharing the load, watching each other's backs. Frank preferred going solo, less talk, more focus. No one to slow him down or second-guess his decisions, and his decisions were absolute. If he decided to cross a pass in a storm, that's what he did. If he chose to track a bull moose for 3 days, he stayed with it until the job was done. One winter, temperatures dropped to 60 below for 2 weeks straight. Most hunters stayed in, waited it out. Frank kept working. He'd build small fires, just enough to keep his hands functioning, then move on, keep the blood flowing, stay alive. Cold will kill you, a trapper told me once, but so will sitting still. It's a balance. Frank found that balance. He respected the cold, prepared for it, but never surrendered to it. There was one close call in 1920. Frank was tracking a caribou herd near the Tok River when a storm blew in from nowhere. Visibility dropped to 0. Wind howling, snow blasting sideways. He lost the trail, lost his bearings. For 3 hours he wandered, growing colder by the minute. Most people would have panicked. Frank just kept moving, working in a grid pattern until he found a familiar landmark, a lightning-struck spruce he recognized even in the whiteout. From there, he navigated to a line shack he knew was nearby, spent 3 days there, waiting out the storm. "Wasn't worried," he said later, "just inconvenienced." The man's capacity for understatement was legendary. By 1924, Frank had established himself as one of the most reliable meat hunters in interior Alaska. Store owners would pay premium prices for his game because they knew it would be properly dressed, properly handled. Frank's meat never spoiled, one shopkeeper said. Man knew how to treat an animal from kill to kitchen. But something was changing in Frank. Years alone in the wild, watching animals, tracking them, killing them, it changes a person. You start to see patterns, start to understand the balance of things. Frank was noticing wolves more and more, seeing how they hunted, how they moved, how they lived. They fascinated him, not as targets, as teachers. The wolves of Alaska were different from those in the lower 48. Bigger, for one thing. 130 pounds wasn't uncommon. Smart, too. They hunted in coordinated packs, taking down moose 10 times their size. Frank watched them whenever he could, made notes, observed their habits. He wasn't studying them scientifically. He was learning from them, the way they chose their prey, the way they moved through snow, the way they conserved energy. Wolves don't waste effort, he told a biologist years later. They don't show off. They do what needs doing, then rest. People could learn from that. Most hunters hated wolves, saw them as competition, as vermin to be eliminated. Frank saw them differently, with respect, maybe even admiration. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't sentimental about them. He still hunted, still killed for meat and money, but he recognized something in those wolves. A kindred spirit, maybe. Another survivor in a land that killed the careless. Winter in Alaska isn't just cold, it's dark. Near the Arctic Circle, the sun barely rises in December and January. Just a few hours of twilight, then darkness again. It messes with your head all that night. Frank adapted, started using the darkness like wolves do, hunting at dusk and dawn when prey is moving, but visibility still works in your favour. He became nocturnal when needed, diurnal when that made more sense. You don't fight the land, he said. You don't fight the weather or the light. You work with what's given. By the end of 1924, Frank was looking for something different. The market hunting was steady work, but it wasn't challenging him anymore. He wanted something more permanent, something he could build. He'd been eyeing a spot along the Savage River, deep in what's now Denali National Park. Remote, wild, game-rich, perfect. That fall, he made his decision. He'd build a cabin there, stake his claim, make it home. I wanted a place, he said simply, just a place that was mine. For nearly a decade, Frank had lived like a ghost, passing through the Alaska wilderness, leaving almost no trace. Now he was ready to put down roots, just not anywhere near other people. The Savage River would be his home for the next 13 years, and there in that isolated valley the legend of the Wolfman would truly begin. That's where we'll pick up next. Frank building his cabin on the Savage River, a home so remote that months would pass without him seeing another human face, a place where wolves would become his closest neighbours, his subjects of study, and eventually his prey. But that night, as he prepared for this new chapter, Frank Glazer slept under stars so bright and cold they seemed to burn. The northern lights danced green and purple across the black sky. The temperature dropped to 30 below. And Frank, wrapped in his sleeping bag beside a small fire, was exactly where he wanted to be. You pull your blanket a little tighter, thinking about that kind of cold, the kind that burns your lungs when you breathe, the kind that turns your breath to ice crystals that fall tinkling to the ground. You're warm, comfortable, safe. Frank Glazer chose to live without any of that comfort in exchange for something most of us will never understand: absolute freedom, absolute solitude, absolute independence. Was it worth it? For Frank, there was never any question. The wild had claimed him. He belonged to Alaska now. Frank Glazer built his Savage River cabin in 10 days flat. No crew, no plans, no power tools, just an axe, muscle, and a brain made for solving problems in the middle of nowhere. Picture yourself in his boots for a second. It's 1924. There's no Home Depot, no YouTube tutorials, no one to call if things go wrong. Just you, standing in a clearing, surrounded by spruce trees and silence, thinking, all right, I need a place that will keep me alive through winter. And winter in Alaska isn't your average winter. It's not grab another sweater cold. It's your spit freezes before it hits the ground cold. It's make one mistake and they'll find your body in spring cold. The cabin Frank built wasn't pretty. Sod roof, dirt floor, logs sealed with mud, ugly as sin but warm, and it was his. Every inch of it came from his own hands. The location was deliberate, deep in the Alaska range. No roads, no people, just how he liked it. By 1924, Frank was done with towns, done with anything resembling civilization. Savage River gave him space, game, and peace. He stayed 13 years. Most people can't stay in one apartment for 13 months without getting restless. I needed a place where I could hear myself think, he told a visitor years later. Fairbanks was getting too crowded. Fairbanks at the time had maybe 2,000 people. The winters there could freeze your lungs when you breathed too deeply, but Frank didn't care. He thrived in conditions that would kill most people in hours. No neighbours, no noise, just wind and wolves. Those wolves, their howls echoed through the valleys at night. When most people heard that sound, they reached for a rifle. When Frank heard it, he listened, really listened, started to learn the different tones, the various messages. Wolves talk to each other, he said once. Not like people talk, better, no lies in it. The cabin became his headquarters. From there, he trapped, hunted, and sometimes hiked blind through blizzards. No compass, just instinct. I always knew where I was, he said years later. Could read the country like a book. His journal from those years was all business. Snowed all night. Cut firewood. Wolf tracks near trapline. But between those clipped lines, life was incredibly rough. When food ran low, he boiled spruce bark for tea. He skinned frozen kills by lantern light, his fingers blue with cold. He dried soaked boots by the stove, knowing that wet feet meant death when temperatures hit 50 below. He always kept his rifle loaded and within reach, not for wolves, but for grizzlies. Spring brought them in close, hungry after hibernation, ready to claim whatever food they could find. One journal entry read simply, "Had a hell of a time crossing river." That's all he wrote. But years later, he told the full story. Swept into an ice-choked current, rifle under one arm, pack-soaked, boots dragging like anchors. He clawed his way to shore, half frozen but alive. In his journal. Just those 8 words. The man didn't waste breath, even on paper. Here's where Frank's story takes a turn that makes him different from other mountain men, other trappers. He didn't just live near wolves, he raised them. Each spring he'd find dens, snatch a few pups and bring them home. He raised them alongside his sled dogs. The result? A team of half-wild, all-muscle hybrids he called wolf dogs. They'd fight like devils, he said, but run like hell when you hooked them up. He fed them caribou scraps, watched how they moved, named them King, Queenie. They weren't pets. Frank didn't do pets. They were workers, partners, a piece of the wild, leashed but never truly tamed. You know how some people get really into their hobbies, like they start making sourdough bread, and suddenly their Instagram is nothing but loaf pictures. Frank got like that with wolves, but there was no Instagram. Just him, alone in his cabin, turning into an amateur scientist. Inside the cabin, Frank became a field biologist without even realizing it. He tracked prints in the snow, studied scat, took detailed notes, sketched wolf movements in the margins of his journal. The walls of his cabin gradually filled with observations, notes on pack structure, hunting patterns, communication, not because anyone asked him to, not for money or fame, just because the wolves fascinated him. By the mid-1930s, Frank dug deeper into wolf study. Alone in his Savage River cabin, something changed. The hunter became a student. He observed how wolves hunted, how they took down the weak, old, or slow prey. People say they kill for fun, he wrote in a note to himself. Not true. They kill to live, and they're better at it than most men. They used their heads, he noticed. Didn't rush, waited, worked together, set up ambushes, cut animals out from herds, tested for weakness before committing to a kill. He saw the dark side too. Wolves turned on their own when resources got scarce. One mistake during a hunt could get you ostracized or dead. They're cold like that, Frank said. No second chances. He took notes on everything. Kills, tracks, scat, even how high they peed on trees. This stuff mattered to Frank. It wasn't just curiosity, it was survival knowledge. Understanding wolves meant understanding the wild. Even professional biologists eventually came to him with questions. A scientist named Adolph Murray used Frank's notes in his book, The Wolves of Mount McKinley. Government officials treated Frank like a field guide in boots. He knew wolves top to bottom, said trapper Oscar Vogel years later, taught me tricks I'd never thought of. And the twist? The more Frank learned, the less he hated them. Yes, he still trapped them when necessary. Yes, he still saw them as competition for game. But something had changed in his perspective. Eliminating wolves? Frank hated that idea, according to fellow agent Jim King years later. It wasn't about wiping them out. It was about balance. By his 50s, folks just called him the Wolf Man. A letter with just that name could still reach him in Fairbanks. He didn't pick the nickname, but it fit. He could track a wolf like it was his brother. He knew where they slept, where they crossed rivers, where they chewed bones in the sun. Frank wasn't soft, but he was fair. Wolves, he said, were survivors, and in Alaska that was the highest compliment. But Savage River wasn't just about blood and biology. It was isolation, deep and harsh, the kind modern people can barely comprehend. Frank could go months without seeing another soul. Winter arrived early up there, usually by September. Snow buried his cabin to the eaves. Temperatures dropped past 50 below and stayed there for weeks. Firewood ran low. Frostbite took pieces of his ears, his nose, his fingers. Yet he never complained, never even seemed to notice the hardship. "I had what I needed," he said. "Meat, water, quiet. What else is there?" Sometimes midwinter he swore he heard voices, the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Once a grizzly raided his meat stash but left no tracks in the fresh snow. "Must have been a ghost," he said, maybe joking, maybe not. Up there, the line between reality and imagination gets thin when you go months without human contact. The solitude affected people differently. Some broke down, couldn't handle it. Frank seemed to need it, like most people need air. "You want to know what silence really sounds like?" he once asked a young trapper. "Come to my place mid-January. That's silence. So quiet, you can hear the blood moving in your ears." One winter, a storm pinned him in the cabin for 3 weeks straight, wind howling, snow piling up so high he had to tunnel out to check his traps. Most people would go stir-crazy. Frank just worked on his wolf notes, repaired gear, read the few books he kept. "Gave me time to think," was all he said about it. His day-to-day existence was all about routine. Wake with the dim winter light around 10 a.m, build up the fire, melt snow for water, check snares close to the cabin, split wood, repair equipment, feed the dogs, all of it harsh physical labour in killing cold. But there was peace in it too, a rhythm most of us will never know. "The thing about Frank," one old-timer told me, "he didn't fight against the wild. He just flowed with it, like water finding its way around rocks." Spring was the hardest time, when snow turned to mud, when rivers swelled with meltwater, when hibernating bears woke hungry. The cabin would start to leak, mould would grow in corners, the dirt floor turned damp. "Ugliest damn time of year," Frank called it. But it brought fresh game, new wolf pups, a chance to repair winter damage, and the midnight sun, those endless summer days where it never gets truly dark. Time to range farther from the cabin, to explore, to build up stores for the next winter. Fall was his favourite. "Everything makes sense in fall," he wrote. Animals fattening up for winter, berries hanging heavy on bushes, the first dusting of snow showing tracks clear as a road map, the world preparing, like him, for the big freeze. In his 6th year at Savage River, the wolves changed, or maybe Frank's perception of them changed. He started seeing them not as competitors, not as subjects of study, but as neighbours, teachers. Something between fear and respect bloomed. A man can live his whole life in cities, surrounded by people, and never understand half of what a wolf knows by its first winter, he said. He gave names to the packs around his territory. The Ridge Pack, the River Pack, knew the alphas by sight, watched the complex social dynamics play out season after season, saw how they passed knowledge to younger wolves, how they adapted to changing conditions. One day, checking his traps, he found a massive black wolf caught by the paw. Most trappers would have shot it immediately. Frank looked at it for a long time. The wolf stared back, yellow eyes unblinking. No fear, just acceptance. Frank shot it, of course. That was his job, his living. But afterward, he sat with the body for hours, skinning it with unusual care, saving not just the pelt, but the skull, the teeth, even the bones. "Felt like I owed it that much," he told a ranger years later. "That wolf died with more dignity than most men." This growing respect for his prey troubled him sometimes, made him question what he was doing, but he was still a practical man. Wolves competed for game he needed to survive. Sometimes they killed sled dogs or went after trap lines. Balance had to be maintained, yet his methods changed. He became more selective, wouldn't take breeding females if he could help it, left the pups unless they were starving, started to think more about the role wolves played in the ecosystem. In 1937, after 13 years at Savage River, something changed. Alaska was changing. More people arriving, more pressure on the wilderness. The federal government was taking a greater interest in wildlife management. Someone in an office somewhere had heard about the trapper who knew wolves better than anyone, who lived among them, who understood them. They offered Frank Glazer a job. Not just any job. They wanted him to be a government wolf hunter. It was a strange twist. The man who'd come to respect wolves, perhaps even love them in his own gruff way, was now being asked to systematically hunt them for the government, to help control populations across Alaska. "I didn't go looking for the job," he said later. "It found me." For Frank, it wasn't a contradiction. It was just another adaptation. Wolves themselves culled the weak from herds. They understood population control. Now he would do the same for them. He accepted the position, packed up his few possessions, took a last look at the cabin that had been his home for 13 years. Wasn't sad to leave it, he told a reporter once. Cabin was just a tool, like an axe or a rifle, did what it was supposed to do. But before he left, he buried something behind the cabin. Years later, a park ranger found it while mapping old structures, a small wooden box containing a complete wolf skull, carefully cleaned and preserved. Next to it, a scrap of paper with a single sentence. "The gentleman of the woods." It was the only sentimental gesture Frank Glazer was ever known to make. As he hiked out of Savage River that spring day in 1937, wolves howled from the ridges above, maybe saying goodbye, maybe warning others of his departure. Frank Glazer had entered the next phase of his life, not just a hunter, not just a trapper, but a man with a mission to know wolves better than anyone else alive, even as he was paid to kill them. "It sounds like a contradiction," he admitted once. Maybe it was, but up here, life is full of contradictions. You kill to live, you love what you hunt. You're never more alive than when you're close to death. The cabin on Savage River still stands, or at least parts of it do. Park rangers have documented it. Historians have photographed it, a simple rectangle of rotting logs in a clearing, slowly returning to the earth. But for 13 years, it was the centre of Frank Glazer's world, a place where he found himself, where he evolved from just another mountain man to something more complex, where the legend of the Wolfman was born. As you lie in your comfortable bed, so far removed from the harsh reality Frank embraced, you might wonder, what drove him to that solitude? What kept him there for 13 years? Was it escape? Discovery? Something deeper? Frank, if asked, would probably just shrug and say, "It suited me." In that simple cabin with its dirt floor, with wolves howling outside and temperatures that could freeze mercury, Frank Glazer wasn't just surviving, he was becoming. The government job would take him all over Alaska, would put his wolf knowledge to the test, would transform him from observer to official predator. The Wolfman was about to hunt wolves full-time with the blessing of Uncle Sam. In 1937, Frank Glazer swapped his traps for a government badge. His new job? Kill wolves. No limits, no paperwork, just results. The US Biological Survey, which would later become the Fish and Wildlife Service, hired him for one reason. Nobody knew wolves like Frank Glazer. Nobody could track them, find them, understand them the way he did. He worked solo, as always. No office, no set hours, no boss breathing down his neck. Just wild, open Alaska and a mission. One week he'd be in the White Mountains with snowshoes and a rifle. The next, crawling across frozen tundra, tracking paw prints through silence so complete you could hear snowflakes land. Frank was happiest 100 miles from anyone, knee-deep in snow, chasing wolves, one agent said years later, and that's exactly what he did. This job suited Frank in ways his previous work hadn't. Market hunting had been about survival, making a living. Trapping at Savage River had been about independence, claiming territory. This government work, this was about mastery, about being the absolute best at something difficult. The spring after he started, he developed a system for finding dens. Wolves are secretive about their breeding sites, protective of their pups, but Frank could read the land like others read books. He'd spot a slight change in a female's movement pattern, notice tracks that circled back to the same area, observe how ravens flew in certain areas. When he found a den, he'd wait, watch, learn the comings and goings of the adults. Then, when the time was right, he'd move in. Winter, he'd set snares along travel routes. Fall, he'd lay poison baits, careful to place them where other animals wouldn't find them. Once aerial hunting was allowed, he took to the skies. A spotter pilot would fly low over the terrain, looking for wolves against the snow. Frank would lean out, rifle ready, and take his shot. "One shot," he said. "Miss, they're gone. Hit, you've got meat." His success rate was incredible. Other hunters would spray bullets, hope for a hit. Frank waited for the perfect moment, then fired once. Clean, efficient, almost merciful. He mastered the getter, a cyanide trap disguised as bait. One sniff and the wolf dropped. It was quick at least. No suffering. Frank insisted on that. Every wolf he killed, he logged. How many, where, when, even the weather conditions. In some remote areas, his notes were the only official records of wildlife for decades. He didn't do this paperwork because it was required. It wasn't. He did it because he believed in knowledge, in understanding. Forms didn't make him deadly. Instinct did. He could read a single hair on snow like a detective. He knew the ridge they'd use, the creek they'd cross, where the alpha would mark territory. Frank could look at grass and tell you what wolves were thinking, one agent said. It wasn't an exaggeration. Locals, particularly the native Alaskans, called him Amaguk Frank, Wolf Frank. He spoke their language, not just the human dialects, but the language of sign, of track, of movement that told stories across the snow. He simply beat wolves at their own game. He became the apex predator in a land full of them. In 1948, the government sent him to Nunivak Island to protect muskox from local hunters. The native people there had been killing the animals, which were being reintroduced after near extinction. Most government men would have gone in hard, with rules and threats. Frank just talked to them, explained the situation, listened to their concerns. After that, the killing stopped, a pilot reported. They listened to him. He was straight with them. Frank never sugarcoated his work. "Wolves breed fast," he wrote in a report. "Traps alone won't cut it. You need poison, planes, den work. The whole deal. Hit hard, don't stop." But even as he said these things, even as he killed wolves more efficiently than any man alive, he respected them, admired them even. Long before GPS collars and remote cameras, long before wildlife biology was a common field of study, Frank was out there with binoculars, watching packs cross frozen rivers, mapping their movements, noting the alpha's lead position, the flanks, the way they herded caribou like soldiers on a raid. "I don't mind shooting wolves," he wrote once to the Game Commission, "but when I find one in my trap, I feel ashamed. They're the real gentlemen of the predatory family." It's a strange contradiction to respect something so deeply while also hunting it, but for Frank there was no contradiction. It was pure survival, pure ecology. Wolves themselves culled the weak from herds. They understood population control. Frank was just doing the same for them. He called himself a conservationist, yet joined predator control, raised wolf dogs, shot wild ones, loved their cunning, hated what they did to the herds. "You got to keep the balance," he said. "Too many wolves and you got no game." His bosses trusted him completely. There's something powerful in that, being so good at something so difficult that people just get out of your way, let you do what needs doing. "As long as I'm director, you've got a job," one boss told him. They'd let him disappear for weeks into the wilderness. He always came back with pelts and data. Frank would file his report, then get antsy to head back out, said one biologist who worked with him. Didn't matter how cold it got. That's when he felt most alive. He rode with university scientists and made them look like lost tourists. One professor watched Frank read the land like a book and said, "He's like an Indian. He knows every bump." With Frank, town life didn't stick. Never did. He kept a room at the Nordale Hotel in Fairbanks and boarded his wolf dogs nearby, but he was rarely around. The wilderness called him, and whenever he was in town, he talked non-stop. All day, breakfast to last patrol, one partner said. But his stories moved. They had rhythm. They took you places most people never went. Frank knew what worked. "Wolf control is simple," he told a rookie agent once. "Find the alpha female, take her out, the pack scatters, sometimes they never reform. Simple, but not easy." Finding that alpha female meant knowing her habits, her preferences, her personality. Frank treated each wolf pack like a puzzle to solve, a challenge to meet. One time, he tracked a particular female wolf for 6 weeks, not because anyone asked him to, not because she was causing trouble, just because she was exceptionally smart, exceptionally cautious. She avoided every trap, every poisoned bait, seemed to vanish into thin air when planes flew overhead. "That one," Frank said, "she was special." He finally got her with a trap so well disguised even he had trouble finding it again. When he approached, she didn't growl, didn't struggle, just watched him with those yellow eyes. He shot her, of course, that was the job, but he kept her skull, cleaned it himself. It sat on a shelf in his room at the Nordale for years. Still, the land had teeth. No matter how good Frank got, Alaska was always ready to kill him. One winter, temperatures dropped to 60 below for 3 weeks straight. Frank was tracking a pack near the Porcupine River. His dog team quit on him, refused to move. Even with their thick fur, it was too cold. He built a fire, set up his tent, waited. 2 days later, still 60 below. Food running low, dogs whining. Most men would have panicked, pushed the dogs too hard, maybe lost them, lost themselves. Frank rigged a sled from spruce boughs, loaded the weakest dogs on it, hitched the stronger ones up and walked in front, breaking trail. Took him 4 days to reach a trapper's cabin. No dogs lost, no fingers lost, just another Alaska story. A young agent asked him once, "Don't you get scared out there alone?" Frank looked at him like he'd asked if water was wet. "Course I get scared," he said. "Man who doesn't get scared in the bush is a fool. Fear keeps you sharp." By the late 1940s, Frank was a legend in Alaska wildlife circles. When someone had a wolf problem, wolves killing sled dogs, wolves decimating moose calves, they called Frank. He'd look at the situation, make a decision, solve the problem, like calling a surgeon for a difficult operation, one rancher said. "You don't tell him how to cut, you just let him work." In the early 1950s, when Frank was in his 60s, his methods started to change. He used more aerial hunting, less trapping. The wolf populations were shifting, moving, adapting to pressure. "Wolves learn," he told a game officer. "You can't use the same tricks twice." So Frank evolved. New baits, new trap setups, new flight patterns. Always thinking, always adapting, just like the wolves did. A few years later, moose populations exploded across his territory. Old-timers said they'd never seen so many, one agent reported. The wolf control was working, or so it seemed. Then Frank left. Wolves came back. Moose vanished. "We need another glazer," locals would say for years afterward. He never wanted fame or thanks, just did the job, quiet and unrelenting. When Alaska became a state in 1959, the wildlife management policies changed. Frank didn't fight it. He simply stepped aside, let younger men take over. He may have never hesitated to kill, but he never forgot what he was killing. Another predator, another survivor in a harsh land, another being just trying to stay alive one more day in the Great White North. In his decades as a wolf hunter, Frank killed hundreds, maybe thousands of wolves. He knew more about them than most biologists with advanced degrees, knew their habits, their family structures, their intelligence. "People think wolves are just big dogs," he said once. They're not. They're something else entirely. Smarter, wilder, more complete. Frank's methods were controversial, even in his time. Some saw him as a conservation hero, keeping ungulate populations healthy by controlling predators. Others saw him as a killer, disrupting natural systems. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. Frank was a man of his time, working with the understanding of ecology available then. He believed in balance, in management, not in extermination. "We don't want to kill all the wolves," he told a reporter once, "just enough to keep everything in check. World needs wolves, just not too many in one place." As Frank aged, his reputation only grew. Wildlife managers across Alaska, across the whole North, consulted him, asked his advice, followed his methods. When Frank Glazer talked wolves, smart people shut up and listened, one biologist said years later. By the time he retired from active wolf hunting in 1955, Frank had changed. The young man who arrived in Alaska in 1915 looking for game and adventure had become something rare, a man who truly understood his place in the wild, not as master, not as intruder, but as participant. "You don't conquer this country," he told a new agent on his last field trip. "You join it, or you leave. Those are the choices." Frank had joined it, merged with it, become so much a part of Alaska that separating the man from the land became impossible. The wolves had taught him that, how to belong to a place so completely that you vanish into it. He'd entered their world, learned their ways, killed them when necessary, respected them always. In doing so, he'd become something of a wolf himself, solitary, resilient, perfectly adapted to a place most humans couldn't survive. As his official hunting days ended, Frank didn't slow down much, still kept his wolf dogs, still tracked and observed, still shared his knowledge with anyone who showed genuine interest. "The government job gave me access," he said. "Let me see more wolves, more places than I could have on my own." By 1955, Frank Glazer was 66 years old. He'd spent 40 years in the Alaskan wilderness, had outlived most of his contemporaries, had survived conditions that killed younger, stronger men. The world was changing around him. Alaska was changing. Wildlife management was becoming more scientific, more bureaucratic. The era of the lone wolf hunter was ending. But Frank Glazer's legacy was just beginning. The knowledge he'd gained, the observations he'd recorded, the methods he'd developed, they formed the foundation of wolf management across the North for decades to come. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Frank out there on the snow, 66 years old, rifle across his knees, watching wolf tracks with eyes that missed nothing. The cold doesn't touch him. The solitude doesn't bother him. He is exactly where he belongs, doing exactly what he was meant to do. There's something rare in that, to find your perfect place, your perfect purpose. Most of us spend our lives searching. Frank found his in the howl of wolves across a frozen valley. His government wolf hunting days had ended, but Frank Glazer's story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. When Frank Glazer retired from official wolf hunting in 1955, the legends were already growing around him like frost on a winter window. Some stories were true, some were stretched, some were flat out impossible, but all of them painted the picture of a man who had become more myth than flesh. Frank Glazer? Yeah, I heard he tracked a wolf pack 50 miles in a blizzard once, found 'em sleeping and took out the whole bunch. Frank? He lived on nothing but spruce needle tea and moose liver one winter, came out healthier than when he went in. That old wolf hunter? They say he could smell a wolf den from 3 miles away. In Fairbanks bars, on trap lines, around hunting campfires, the tales spread, each one making Frank a little larger, a little wilder, a little more than human. But here's the thing about wilderness legends. Underneath the exaggeration, there's usually a kernel of truth harder than permafrost. Take the car story. In 1938, Frank was driving a government vehicle along the Steese Highway. The road was icy, visibility poor, the car skidded, rolled 3 times down an embankment. Most men would have been killed instantly. Frank crawled out with cracked ribs and a cut on his head. His diary entry for that day. Rolled over 3 times, cut on head, rib injuries, dry as sawdust. No drama. Anyone else would have died, or at least milked it for sympathy. Frank just hitched a ride to the next roadhouse, got patched up, and was back tracking wolves within a week. Then there were the wolf dogs, not just working animals. These were monsters with steel-trap jaws and glacier blue eyes. One massive black wolf he kept chained in a cabin let Frank stroll in with food like it was perfectly normal. Sam White, a hardened trapper who'd seen everything Alaska had to offer, said, "I wouldn't have gone near it unless it was trussed in chains." Frank didn't exactly tame these animals. He simply earned their tolerance, maybe even their trust. He understood them in a way most humans never will. Animals know when you fear them, he told a rookie agent once, and they know when you respect them. Most people get those 2 things mixed up. In the late 1950s, after his official retirement, Frank still consulted for wildlife management, still went out on expeditions, still knew the wolves of Alaska better than anyone alive. There's a story about a bison hunt around that time. Frank, in his late 60s, tags along with a college professor who'd never aimed at anything more dangerous than a thought. Frank tracks the bull, lines up the shot, and hands it off to the academic. 2 shots ring out. One hits the chest, one clips an ear, Frank's ear. The bull drops. No one asks who made the kill. They all knew. Frank just wrapped his bloody ear in a bandana and kept going. Didn't even mention it until someone noticed the blood soaking through. Bush pilots would often drop him in the Arctic with nothing but snowshoes and a rifle. 2 weeks later, he'd radio back from a completely different location with a sack full of wolf tails and a craving for fresh meat. Jim King, who worked with him in the Wildlife Service, remembered how Frank couldn't stand office work. By day 3, he'd get itchy. Wolves needed thinning, he'd say. He'd be gone before you could stop him. In Fairbanks, he stalked the streets like a wolf behind glass. People knew him. He boarded his wolf dogs nearby, kept a room at the Nordale Hotel, and bought every new rifle that came into town. He even slipped cash to broke trappers who couldn't cover their bar tabs. Frank never flashed money, an old bartender told me, but he always had it when it mattered. Even when he had money, he lived lean. Even when alone, he didn't seem lonely. He chewed snuff, quit in the hospital once, cursed it afterward, then picked it back up like nothing had changed. His boots stayed laced, rifles spotless, eyes sharp into his 60s. Never wore glasses. could still spot a wolf on a ridge where younger men saw nothing. He moved like a man shaped by snow, sleds, and survival. When he talked, it came out in stored-up bursts like he'd been holding it in for years. To the old-timers, Frank was legend attached to memory. Governor J. Hammond called him Lobo lean with gun-bore eyes and a gait like a penned-up predator. Joked he might have been part wolf himself, always prowling, always alert, always one step from slipping into the wild again. Frank never married, never had children. The wilderness was his wife, one friend said, and the wolves were his kids. Dysfunctional family, but it worked for him. In his 70s, when most men are content to sit by windows and remember, Frank was still out there, still tracking, still watching, still learning from the wolves he'd spent a lifetime studying. His methods had changed with age, less hunting, more observation. He'd spend days just watching a pack, noting their behaviours, their movements, their social dynamics. I used to kill 'em to understand 'em, he told a biologist in the 1960s. Now I just watch, learn more that way. By then, scientific methods had caught up with what Frank had known for decades. Wolf packs weren't just random groups, they were families with complex social structures. Alphas weren't always the biggest or strongest, they were the smartest, the most experienced. Wolves didn't kill for sport, they killed what they needed when they needed it. All things Frank had been saying for 40 years. Sometimes, a wildlife manager told me, I think Frank was born a century too early. He'd have made one hell of a wildlife biologist with the right schooling. But formal education was never Frank's path. His classroom had been the wild itself, his teachers the wolves he hunted and observed. His knowledge wasn't theoretical, it was earned through frozen feet and hungry nights and the kind of patience most humans can't fathom. Even in his final years, stories about Frank kept circulating. He disappeared for a month into the Brooks Range, people said, and came back with detailed maps of wolf den locations that would have taken a scientific team years to compile. He'd tracked a particular alpha female over 3 mountain ranges just because he admired her cunning. He'd sat outside a wolf den for 2 days, not moving, barely breathing, just to watch how the adults taught their pups to pounce on mice. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated, but knowing Frank, many were probably true. In a way, he'd become the alpha of his own strange pack. The wildlife managers, trappers, hunters, and biologists who followed his methods, who quoted his observations, who treated his word on wolves as gospel. Frank didn't just teach us about wolves, one agent said years later. He taught us about Alaska, about respecting what can kill you, about really seeing the land, not just looking at it. As decades passed, Alaska changed dramatically around Frank Glazer. The territory became a state in 1959. Roads pushed deeper into the wilderness. Airplanes made even the most remote areas accessible. Tourism grew. Population centers expanded. Frank watched these changes with a mixture of resignation and concern. More people meant more pressure on wildlife. More roads meant less true wilderness. More regulation meant the end of the frontier freedom he'd cherished. Place isn't the same, he'd grumble. Too damn many people. This from a man who thought Fairbanks was crowded when it had 2,000 residents. By the late 1960s, Frank's health was finally beginning to match his age. Decades of cold, of physical hardship, of survival at the edge of endurance. It takes a toll no human can escape forever. His hands, once steady enough to place a bullet exactly where he wanted it at 300 yards, began to shake slightly. His knees, which had carried him thousands of miles through snow and tundra, ached constantly. His ears, frostbitten repeatedly, were sensitive to the slightest cold. But his mind remained sharp, his knowledge intact, his stories vivid. Young wildlife researchers would seek him out, buy him a meal or a drink, ask about wolves. Frank, never one for small talk, would dismiss basic questions, but show genuine interest, ask something specific, and the floodgates would open. He talked for 6 hours straight, one biologist remembered, drew diagrams on napkins, sketched wolf hunting patterns in spilled beer on the table. Most educational night of my life. In his last decade, Frank became something of an unofficial consultant to wolf researchers across Alaska. They'd bring him maps, photographs, data. He'd point to a spot and say, "Check here, den site, south-facing slope, near water but not too near, protected from wind." And they'd check, and he'd be right, almost every time. "How do you know?" one frustrated PhD candidate asked him after Frank had correctly predicted a pack's migration route that contradicted all the researchers' carefully collected data. Frank just tapped the side of his head. 40 years watching wolves, son. Can't learn that from books. By the early 1970s, Frank was one of the last of his kind, a link to the old Alaska, the frontier Alaska, where survival depended on skill and knowledge rather than equipment and technology. He watched with a mixture of approval and skepticism as wildlife management became more scientific. Radio collars, aerial surveys, computer modelling, population dynamics. "All that science is fine," he told a game officer, "but sometimes you just need to sit and watch a wolf be a wolf. Can't put that in a computer." Frank had seen wolf populations rise and fall over decades, had seen management strategies come and go, had watched the shifting relationship between predator and prey play out across the vastness of Alaska. "Wolves and game are like a pendulum," he said. "Too many wolves, game goes down. Too few wolves, game goes up. Then disease or starvation swings it back. Our job is just to keep the swing from going too far either way." It was a simple philosophy, but one based on a lifetime of observation, of being there, on the ground, in all seasons, in all conditions, of knowing the land and its creatures intimately, personally. As Frank entered his 80s, his legend only grew. Letters addressed simply to the Wolfman, Fairbanks, Alaska, would find him without fail. People who had never met him told stories about him, claimed their father or uncle or grandfather had hunted with the famous Frank Glazer. Some of these claims were true, many weren't, but that's how legends work. They outgrow the truth, become something bigger, something that belongs not just to the man himself, but to the place, to the culture, to the collective imagination. "I heard Frank Glazer could call wolves," people would say. They'd come right to him, like he spoke their language. "I heard he lived with a pack for a month, slept in their den, ate what they ate. I heard he could smell the difference between wolf packs, know exactly whose territory he was in just by scent." Frank, when he heard these tales, would just snort and say, "Damn fools don't know a thing about wolves." But maybe, in some way, he was pleased, not at being the centre of tall tales, but at knowing wolves had become important to people, that people cared enough to make up stories, that the animals he'd spent a lifetime tracking, hunting and studying had captured the imagination of a generation who would never know the old Alaska as he had. In 1974, Frank Glazer died at the age of 85. No fancy funeral, no great public mourning, just a small notice in the Fairbanks paper. Francis Glazer, longtime resident and retired wildlife agent, passed away Tuesday at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. A simple end for a man who had lived an extraordinary life. But in Alaska, Frank Glazer never really left. His name still rides the wind, hooked onto wolf howls. His stories thunder across bar tops, slip through trapline cabins and rumble out of old-timers' mouths when they talk about how things used to be. The man is gone, but the myth is still kicking. You close your eyes, feeling the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket, so different from the harsh ground Frank slept on for most of his life, so far removed from the killing cold of an Alaskan winter night. And somewhere, in that space between waking and sleeping, you can almost hear it, the howl of wolves across a snow-covered valley, the sound Frank Glazer followed for 40 years, through blizzards and darkness, through solitude and silence, through a life most of us can barely imagine. A life wild and harsh and free. The first wolf biologists to use radio collars in Alaska made an interesting discovery in the 1980s. After months of high-tech tracking, sophisticated data analysis and computer modelling, they concluded something that would have made Frank Glazer laugh. Wolves behaved exactly as he'd been saying they did for decades. We spent $500,000 to confirm what Frank told us for free, one researcher admitted later. Frank's observations, made with nothing more than binoculars, patience, and a mind that missed nothing, had been dead accurate. Pack territories averaged the size he'd estimated. Hunting patterns followed his descriptions. Den site selections matched his predictions. The man had been a walking, talking wolf encyclopedia long before modern science caught up. But Frank's legacy runs deeper than just being right about wolves. His impact spreads through Alaska's wildlife management like roots through permafrost. The hunters, trappers and biologists he mentored carried his knowledge forward, shaping how the last frontier manages its predators. Frank never wrote a book, said Jim Reardon, an outdoor writer who knew him well. Never published scientific papers, but he taught a generation of wildlife folks more about wolves than any university ever could. His methods, the way he read tracks, the way he set traps, the way he understood wolf behaviour, became standard practice, often without people even knowing where the techniques originated. Jack Wilson was 16 when he first met Frank. It was 1962, and Jack's father had hired the aging wolfman to deal with predators killing their sled dogs. "I remember this skinny old guy climbing out of the bush plane," Jack told me years later. "Didn't say much, just asked to see whether dogs had been killed." Frank spent 10 minutes examining the scene, then pointed to tracks most people would never have noticed. 3 wolves, he said. Young pack, inexperienced. They'll be back tomorrow night. Jack's father asked how he could be so sure. "Killed messy," Frank said. "Didn't eat much, still hungry?" "Still learning." That night, Frank set 3 traps in places that seemed random to Jack. The next morning, they caught 2 wolves. The third never returned to the area. Dad offered him a bonus, Jack remembered. Frank just shook his head and said, "Regular pay is fine." Wasn't about money for him. Before Frank left, Jack, wolf crazy like most teenage boys, peppered him with questions. To everyone's surprise, Frank answered them. Spent an hour showing the kid how to read wolf sign, how to understand what the tracks were saying. "Changed my life," Jack said. "Ended up studying wildlife management in college because of that 1 hour with Frank Glazer." There are dozens of stories like this. People whose brief encounters with Frank shaped their understanding of wilderness, of wolves, of Alaska itself. A woman named Sarah Komar met Frank in 1968 when she was a graduate student researching wolf vocalizations. She'd spent months recording howls, trying to decode their meaning. Frank listened to some of her recordings, then took out a pencil and paper, drew a diagram of what each howl meant. Short barks, warning, long rising howls, location calls, quick yips, excitement over a kill. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Listened," he said simply, "for 40 years. Her thesis committee initially dismissed Frank's interpretations. He had no degree, no scientific credentials, but when she played recordings to wolves in captivity, their reactions matched Frank's predictions exactly. The professors called it a lucky guess, Sarah told me. It wasn't. Frank understood wolf language better than any human alive. These stories matter because they show something important about Frank Glazer. He wasn't just a killer of wolves, he was their student, their translator, maybe even their advocate in his own complex way. Frank had this saying, remembered Tom Clausen, who worked with him in the 1950s. Know what you're killing meant don't just shoot something because it's there. Understand it, respect it, make the death mean something. In the decades since Frank's passing, Alaska has changed dramatically. Wilderness has receded, tourism has exploded, wildlife management has become more political, more complicated. But out there, in the vast stretches that remain wild, wolves still howl, still hunt, still live lives not so different from the ones Frank observed decades ago. In some ways, Frank would hardly recognise today's Alaska. Fairbanks, once a frontier outpost, is now a modern city. The Savage River, where his cabin stood for 13 years, runs through Denali National Park, visited by thousands of tourists each summer. Those visitors, snapping photos from tour buses, might catch a glimpse of a wolf loping across a distant ridge. A brief encounter with wildness, safely contained. Frank lived differently. He didn't visit the wild. He inhabited it, merged with it, became part of its brutal, beautiful rhythm. Frank wasn't watching wolves from the outside, said Bill Nanak, a native Alaskan who hunted with Frank in the 1960s. He was inside their world, thinking like them, moving like them. Sometimes I wondered if he thought he was one of them. There's a story from the early 1950s that captures this perfectly. Frank was tracking a pack near the Yukon border in midwinter, temperature around 30 below zero. He'd been following them for days, observing their hunting patterns. One night he made camp on a ridge overlooking their kill site. A moose they'd brought down in a frozen marsh. Instead of setting up his tent, Frank dug a snow cave, just like wolves do during storms. Around midnight, the alpha male approached Frank's position, stood 20 yards away, looking directly at him. Frank remained absolutely still. Man and wolf stared at each other for nearly 10 minutes. Then the wolf did something extraordinary. It turned its back on Frank and sat down. A gesture that, among wolves, signals trust. Never told anyone about that until years later, said Pete Raftery, who heard the story directly from Frank. Said it was too personal, like a religious experience. When Frank finally shared the story, he added, "That wolf knew exactly what I was, knew I was a killer of his kind. But he also knew I understood him, respected him. That was enough." These moments of connection, a human and a wild creature seeing each other truly, were rare and precious to Frank. He didn't talk about them much, didn't need to romanticize them, but they shaped him, changed him. The young man who arrived in Alaska in 1915 was not the same person who died there in 1974. The wilderness transformed him, and wolves were his greatest teachers. Late in his life, Frank told a young biologist, "You want to understand wolves? Stop trying to make them something they're not. They're not monsters. They're not saints. They're just trying to stay alive in a hard world. Same as you, same as me." This clear-eyed perspective, seeing wolves as they truly are, not as human fears or fantasies project them to be, was perhaps Frank's greatest contribution to wildlife science. In the decades after Frank's death, wolf management in Alaska became increasingly controversial. Some wanted wolves eliminated to boost game populations. Others wanted them protected completely. The middle ground, where Frank had stood, seemed to vanish into partisan extremes. Frank would have hated the politics of it all, said George Peterson, who worked in wildlife management in the 1980s. He believed in balance, in managing, not eliminating, in respecting the role of predators, even as you controlled their numbers. This balance, this recognition that wolves belong in Alaska, but so do humans with their own needs and interests, seems increasingly rare in modern debates. The nuance that Frank understood through direct experience gets lost in ideology. Frank wasn't pro-wolf or anti-wolf, said Ray Morris, who trapped with him in the 1960s. He was pro-balance, pro-ecosystem. He understood that everything out there is connected. This ecological understanding came not from textbooks, but from decades of observation. From watching what happened when wolves were removed from an area, from seeing how prey populations exploded, then crashed from disease or starvation, from recognizing the complex relationships that keep wilderness healthy. He told me once that killing every wolf would be like removing your liver, Ray remembered. You might feel fine at first, but pretty soon the whole system breaks down. Beyond his impact on wolf science, beyond his legendary status in Alaska lore, there was something else about Frank Glazer that deserves remembering. Something more personal, more human. He found his purpose. In a world where many people drift through life never quite sure what they're meant to do, Frank knew. From that first brutal trek to Fairbanks in 1915 to his final days, he lived exactly the life he chose. Most folks spend their whole lives fighting against what they are, said Bill Pearson, who knew Frank in his later years. Frank just was. No pretense, no trying to be something else, just a man who found his place and lived in it completely. That authenticity drew people to him, made them listen when he spoke, made them remember him decades after he was gone. In 1998, almost 25 years after Frank's death, biologists studying wolves in Denali National Park made a discovery. They found the remains of a cabin near the Savage River. Frank's cabin. After all those years, traces still remained. Rusted trap parts, a broken snowshoe, the foundation stones of his fireplace. They also found something unexpected, a metal box buried near the cabin site. Inside was a small notebook, its pages yellowed but still legible. Frank's handwriting, precise and small. It wasn't a diary or journal, not in the traditional sense. It was a record of wolves. Individual wolves Frank had known over his years at Savage River. Names he'd given them, descriptions, personalities. Black female, scar on muzzle, smart, cautious at kills, good mother, died winter, 29. Grey male, distinctive howl, bold hunter, led pack for 6 years, killed by younger male spring 34. White female, small for her age, quick learner, left to form new pack fall 31, successful. On and on, dozens of wolves, each remembered, each noted with a precise, almost tender attention to detail. The biologists who found the notebook were stunned. This wasn't the record of a simple wolf killer. This was the work of someone who knew these animals intimately, who saw them as individuals, who recognized their unique traits and histories. It was like finding Jane Goodall's notes on chimps, one researcher said, except Frank was doing this kind of detailed observation decades earlier, with no training, no support, no recognition. The notebook is now preserved in the University of Alaska archives, a small private testament to a relationship between man and wolf that defies easy categorization. In your warm bed, far from the killing cold of an Alaskan winter, far from the howl of wolves across moonlit snow, it's hard to fully grasp what drove Frank Glazer, what kept him in that wilderness alone year after year. But maybe there's something in all of us that recognizes the appeal of such clarity, such purpose, such belonging. Frank once told a young trapper who asked why he lived as he did, "Out there, everything makes sense. You're hungry, you hunt, you're cold, you build fire, you're tired, you rest. Simple, true, no one telling you who to be or what matters." In that simplicity, that directness, Frank found freedom, not the shallow freedom of doing whatever you want, but the deeper freedom of living in accordance with your nature, of being fully yourself in a world that so often asks us to be something else. The wolves taught him that. They don't pretend, don't compromise their nature. They simply are what they are. Predators, survivors, members of an ancient social order that functions perfectly without human intervention. Frank learned from them, became more wolf-like himself, direct, uncompromising, attuned to the rhythms of the wild, comfortable with solitude. "You know what I admired most about him," said Jean Adams, who interviewed Frank for an article in 1970. "He wasn't lonely. Most people can't stand being alone for a day. Frank went months without seeing another human and was completely at peace with it." That capacity for solitude, for self-reliance, seems increasingly rare in our connected modern world. We're always in touch, always reachable, always surrounded, if not physically, then digitally. Frank lived differently. His connections were to place, to wolves, to the vast Alaskan wilderness that shaped him over decades. "Last time I saw him," Ray Morris told me, "he was sitting on the porch of the Nordale Hotel, just watching people go by. I asked what he was doing. He said, 'Observing the strangest animal of all.' Then he laughed. Only time I ever heard him really laugh." That distance, that ability to see humans as just another species, neither better nor worse than wolves, gave Frank a perspective few people ever achieve. He watched us with the same clear, unromantic eye he turned on wolves, saw our patterns, our social structures, our strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps in that seeing he found a kind of peace, an acceptance of the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine Frank one last time. Not the legend, not the myth, just a man who found his place in the world and inhabited it fully, who listened to wolves howl across snow-covered valleys and heard something most of us will never hear. The authentic voice of the wild, speaking directly to something ancient and knowing in himself. In that exchange, wolf to man, wild to human, Frank Glazer found something worth dedicating his life to, something worth remembering, even decades after he's gone. If you fly over Alaska today, you'll see a landscape that would both surprise and sadden Frank Glazer. Roads cut into valleys he once crossed on foot, tourist lodges perch where he once camped alone, airstrips flatten tundra he navigated by the stars. But look more carefully past the human footprint into the vast stretches that remain wild, and you'll see something Frank would recognize. Wolves, still running free, still hunting, still howling across valleys as they have for thousands of years. Alaska's wilderness has shrunk, but it hasn't disappeared, and in the people who work there, who study it, who fight to protect it, Frank Glazer's influence lives on, sometimes in unexpected ways. Take Mike Robards. He's a wolf biologist who spent 20 years tracking packs across Denali National Park, the same area where Frank built his cabin on the Savage River almost a century ago. First time I read about Frank Glazer, I thought he was the enemy, Mike told me, sitting in his small office in Fairbanks. I mean, the guy killed hundreds, maybe thousands of wolves. As a conservationist, how could I admire that? But the more Mike learned about Frank, his methods, his observations, his deep understanding of wolf behaviour, the more his perspective shifted. What struck me was his respect for them, Mike said. He wasn't killing out of hatred or fear. He was doing a job, maintaining a balance, and along the way he learned things about wolves that we're still confirming with our fancy technology decades later. Mike gestured to a wall of computer equipment, tracking software, satellite data. We've got all this now, and sometimes I think Frank would laugh at us. He'd say, just go sit on that ridge for a week and watch. You'll learn more than your computers will ever tell you. That direct experiential knowledge, the kind that comes from patient observation rather than data analysis, is increasingly rare in wildlife science, but a few people still practice it, still value what Frank knew, that understanding comes from time spent watching, listening, being present in an animal's world. Lisa Kowalski is one of those people. She's not a scientist, not a wildlife manager. She's a wilderness guide who takes small groups into remote areas of Alaska to observe wolves in their natural habitat. I'm out there 3-4 months a year, she told me, just watching, just being with the wolves on their terms. I've read all about Frank Glazer, different time, different goals, but same approach. You want to understand wolves, you go where they are, you adapt to their world, not the other way around. Lisa has followed one particular pack, the East Fork pack in Denali, for over a decade, knows each wolf individually, can recognise them by sight, by howl, by track. People ask me how I can tell them apart, she said. I just can, same way you can tell your friends apart in a crowd. Once you really look, really see them as individuals, it's obvious. That echoes Frank's notebook with its detailed descriptions of individual wolves he'd known over years. That recognition that wolves aren't interchangeable units in a population, but distinct beings with personalities, histories, roles within their packs. I never met Frank Glazer, Lisa said, but sometimes sitting on a ridge watching wolves hunt, I feel like he's sitting right beside me, noticing the same things, asking the same questions. This sense of connection across time, of shared experience despite vastly different contexts, comes up again and again when talking to people who work with wolves in Alaska. Tony Peterson flies bush planes into remote areas for wildlife surveys. He's tracked wolf packs from the air for 30 years, working for various agencies and research projects. In training, they showed us Frank's maps from the 1940s and 50s, Tony told me. Hand-drawn, incredibly detailed, and you know what? They're still accurate. Pack territories, denning areas, travel corridors, they haven't changed much in 70 years. Tony keeps a copy of one of Frank's maps in his plane, faded, creased from use, but still a valuable reference. He didn't have GPS or satellite imagery, Tony said, just his eyes and his brain and thousands of hours in the field. Made me realise there's no substitute for that kind of direct experience. Even those who might seem most opposed to Frank's work, modern wolf advocates and conservationists, often express a grudging respect for him. Sarah Johnston works for a non-profit dedicated to wolf protection in Alaska. When I mentioned Frank Glazer's name, she didn't react with the hostility I expected. Look, he was a product of his time, she said. The government hired him to kill wolves, and that's what he did. But he didn't hate them. He respected them, understood them, and his observations helped build the foundation of what we know about wolf ecology today. She leaned forward, elbows on her desk. The irony is, some of our strongest arguments for wolf protection come from Frank's own notes. He documented their complex social structures, their role in maintaining healthy ecosystems, their intelligence and adaptability. He saw them clearly, without romanticism, but also without demonization. That clear seeing is still valuable, regardless of what side of the conservation debate you're on. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect of Frank Glazer's legacy, that a man who killed wolves professionally for decades has become, in some ways, an ally to those who seek to protect them. His detailed observations, his insistence on understanding wolves as they truly are, rather than as human fears or fantasies paint them, provides common ground in debates that often seem hopelessly polarized. Frank would have hated how political wolf management has become, said James Wilson, who worked in wildlife management for 40 years. He believed in balance, in making decisions based on what's happening on the ground, not ideology, in respecting wolves even as you recognise that sometimes their numbers need to be controlled. That pragmatic, experience-based approach seems increasingly rare in environmental debates where extreme positions often drown out nuanced understandings. But in Alaska, where wolves and humans still share the landscape, Frank's balanced perspective remains influential among those who work directly with wildlife. Most of the old-timers who knew Frank are gone now, James told me, but their stories about him, their memories of what he taught them, that's still being passed down, still shaping how we think about wolves. One such story comes from Ben Taller, now in his 80s, who briefly worked with Frank in the 1950s. "We were flying over the Koyukuk River drainage, spotting for wolves," Ben recalled. "Found a pack feeding on a moose." On June 14, 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France, faced complete defeat at the Battle of Marengo when 30,000 Austrian troops surprised his scattered forces. By mid-afternoon, his army was in full retreat and victory seemed impossible, but within hours, one of history's most dramatic battlefield reversals would cement Napoleon's legend and change the fate of Europe. Here's what it was really like to experience Napoleon's greatest comeback. Before we start, if these stories help you sleep, hitting subscribe would be amazing. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your location and time in the comments. Sometimes I see someone from Tokyo commenting at what's like 3 a.m. my time. Okay, tonight we're heading back to the Napoleonic Wars. But before we go anywhere, get comfortable. Seriously, take a second, adjust your pillows, fix that blanket. Where we're going, you're definitely going to want to be settled in. Your eyes flutter open to a damp grey dawn in northern Italy. The first thing that hits you is the soreness. Every muscle in your body aches like you've been trampled by horses. You're not in your cosy bed with its memory foam and clean sheets. No, you're sprawled on hard-packed earth with only a thin, scratchy wool blanket between you and the ground. The June morning should be warm, but there's a chill that seeps right into your bones from the rain-soaked soil beneath you. Around you, thousands of French soldiers are stirring in the pre-dawn light. The smell is, let's just say, an army of men who haven't bathed in weeks creates its own special aroma. Sweat, leather, gunpowder, and something else, that underlying tension that comes before battle. Up. Get up. Citizen. The Austrians are moving. The shout jolts you fully awake. The year is 1800, and you're a soldier in Napoleon Bonaparte's army of reserve. And this day, June 14th, will become one of the most legendary in military history, though right now it just feels like another miserable morning in a foreign country where people keep trying to kill you. You scramble to your feet, grabbing your musket. Your stomach growls painfully. Dinner last night was a half ration of mouldy bread that you had to choke down with some questionable water. The supply wagons are somewhere far behind the army, and foraging parties haven't brought back much. Napoleon's bold strategy of crossing the Alps has gotten you behind enemy lines, but it's also gotten you pretty damn hungry. "They're saying the Austrians are attacking from Alessandria," mutters the soldier next to you, a grizzled veteran named Marcel with a magnificent moustache and a missing front tooth. "But that can't be right. The first consul said they'd be retreating." That's the thing about Napoleon Bonaparte. He's a military genius, sure, but even geniuses make mistakes, and this morning he's made a big one. See, Napoleon's convinced that the Austrian army under General Michael von Melas is trying to escape east, so he spread his forces out across miles of countryside to catch them. You and about 15,000 other French troops are around the village of Marengo, while another 10,000 are scattered elsewhere. It's a smart plan if the enemy is actually retreating, but they're not. As the morning fog lifts, an unmistakable sound rolls across the plains like distant thunder, cannon fire, a lot of it. "Holy shit," Marcel whispers, his face going pale beneath his weathered tan. "That's a full attack. Within minutes, officers are shouting orders, drummers are beating assembly, and your regiment is forming up. Through gaps in the morning mist, you catch glimpses of the Austrian army emerging from Alessandria, not retreating at all, but advancing in full force, 30,000 men with over 100 cannons against your scattered 15,000 with barely a dozen guns. Wait, this can't be right. Napoleon is supposed to be the one surprising enemies, not the other way around. But here you are. The first consul was wrong, someone says nearby. We're completely outnumbered, and just like that, you're marching forward into what might be the last day of your life. See, Napoleon Bonaparte's not actually with you. That's another problem. He's miles away at his headquarters, convinced the Austrians are retreating, not attacking. By the time messengers reach him with news of the assault, precious hours will be lost. The initial Austrian attack hits like a hammer. Their artillery opens up and the sound is deafening, not just the boom of the cannons, but the whistling shriek of round shot tearing through the air, followed by the sickening thud when it finds its target. You watch in horror as a cannonball rips through your formation, taking 3 men with it in a spray of red. Your regiment forms up along a small stream called the Fontenone. It's not much of a defensive position, just a narrow waterway with steep banks, but it's all you've got. The orders are simple. Hold this line at all costs. The Austrians come in waves, their white uniforms standing out against the green fields. Their first assault hits the French centre, where General Victor's division is positioned. Your own regiment is part of General Lanz's division, off to the right flank. "Oh, steady," your captain shouts. "Wait for the order." The first Austrian attack is repulsed. Men cheer around you. Maybe this won't be so bad after all, but then you look west and your heart sinks. More Austrian columns are forming up, a lot more. "I've been in 12 battles, Marcel says, calmly reloading his musket, and I've never seen odds this bad. "Then why are you so calm?" you ask, your own hands shaking as you try to reload. He shrugs. "If today's my day, it's my day. Besides, I've seen the little corporal pull off miracles before." The little corporal, that's what veterans like Marcel call Napoleon, a nickname from his early days as a young artillery officer. But right now, the little corporal is nowhere to be seen and his soldiers are in serious trouble. The second Austrian attack is stronger than the first. They've brought up more artillery, and the French line along the Fontenone is being pounded mercilessly. The air fills with smoke so thick you can barely see 20 paces ahead. The roar of gunfire becomes continuous, not individual shots, but a rolling thunder of muskets and cannon. Time loses meaning in battle. Minutes stretch like hours. Hours compress into moments. The fighting along the Fontenone continues throughout the morning, attack after attack. The stream's water runs red in places. The bodies pile up on both banks. By noon, the situation is dire. The Austrians have found a gap north of your position and are threatening to outflank the entire French line. General Victor's division in the centre is running dangerously low on ammunition. Some units have completely run out, reduced to using their muskets as clubs or throwing stones. Then the worst happens. The Austrian weight of numbers finally tells. Their 30,000 men and 100 guns against the French, 16,000 men and 15 guns is simply too much. First one French regiment breaks, then another. The retreat begins, and once it starts, it's hard to stop. Your captain shouts for an orderly withdrawal, but there's nothing orderly about what follows. The French line collapses, and suddenly you're running eastward across those same fields you defended all morning. Austrian cavalry appears, charging into the retreating French infantry. Men who stop to make a stand are cut down. "Stay together," Marcel shouts over the chaos. "If we scatter, we're dead." Your regiment manages to maintain some cohesion as it falls back, fighting a desperate rearguard action. But all around you, the French army is disintegrating. By 3 in the afternoon, the battle seems utterly lost. The French have been driven back almost a mile from their original positions, leaving behind their dead, their wounded, and most of their artillery. This is what defeat looks like. Complete catastrophic defeat. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, a messenger finally reaches Napoleon Bonaparte with the news that his army is fighting for its life. The story goes that when Napoleon heard the distant sound of cannon fire that morning, he dismissed it. Just a reconnaissance in force, he supposedly said. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul of France and arguably the greatest military mind of his generation, could make a colossal misjudgment. By the time he realizes his error and races toward the battlefield, the situation appears hopeless. The French army that had marched triumphantly over the Alps is now streaming eastward in retreat, pursued by victorious Austrians. You're exhausted, parched and terrified as you stumble across the plains east of Marengo. Your unit has been reduced to perhaps half its original strength. Marcel is still with you, blood streaming from a minor wound on his forehead but otherwise intact. "This is it," someone nearby says. "The campaign is over. We'll be lucky to make it back to France alive." The retreat continues throughout the early afternoon. The Austrian pursuit, thankfully, isn't particularly aggressive. General Melas, the 70-year-old Austrian commander, believes he's won a decisive victory. So confident is he in his triumph that he returns to Alessandria to write his victory dispatch, leaving his chief of staff, General Zach, to handle the pursuit. It's a decision that will go down as one of the worst in military history. Around 5 o'clock, as your shattered regiment reaches the village of San Giuliano, something unexpected happens. Fresh troops appear on the road, French troops, marching westward toward the sound of battle, not away from it. "Who are they?" you ask, staring in disbelief. Marcel squints, then breaks into a gap-toothed grin. "That's Desai's division, they've come back." General Louis Desai had been detached from the main army with his division of 5,000 men to block what Napoleon thought would be the Austrian escape route. When Desai heard the distant sound of battle, he turned his division around and marched to the sound of the guns, a soldier's most sacred duty. Now, as the sun begins its westward descent, Desai's fresh troops are arriving on the battlefield, and with them is Napoleon himself, rallying the retreating soldiers. "I've gone far enough for today," Napoleon announces to his men. "It is my habit to sleep on the field of battle. The effect on morale is electric. Retreating soldiers stop in their tracks. Scattered units reform. Napoleon, the master psychologist as well as the master strategist, knows exactly what his demoralized army needs to hear." Wait, am I making this up? Did he actually say that? Look, Napoleon was basically a walking quote machine. Half the things attributed to him were probably made up later, but it makes for a damn good story, right? Desai reportedly tells Napoleon, "This battle is completely lost." But it's only 3 o'clock. There is still time to win another. And that's exactly what they set out to do. Napoleon quickly develops a new plan. While the remnants of his battered army reform their lines, Desai's fresh division will prepare a counterattack. General Marmont gathers all available artillery, just 18 guns, and positions them to blast the advancing Austrians. Meanwhile, General Kellerman's heavy cavalry, which has remained relatively intact, is held in reserve for the decisive moment. The Austrians, believing they're simply mopping up a defeated enemy, advance in a long column along the main road, their guard down. It's General Zach leading the Austrian advance guard of Grenadiers elite troops, but moving forward with the casual confidence of men who think the fighting is over. They have no idea what's about to hit them. At about 5:30, Desai's division strikes. The 9th Light Regiment leads the attack, pouring heavy fire into the surprised Austrians. For a moment, the Austrians waver, but then begin to form up to meet this unexpected threat. It's at this critical moment that tragedy strikes. General Desai, leading from the front as always, is shot through the heart and dies instantly. His last words, according to legend, tell the first consul that I die regretting that I have not done enough to live in posterity. Again, with the suspiciously perfect last words. I mean, who knows if he actually said that? The guy just got shot through the heart, not exactly prime time for eloquent speeches, but it's one of those stories that's too good to not tell. The death of their commander could have broken the French attack. Instead, it galvanizes Desai's men. "Avenge our general" becomes their battle cry as they surge forward with renewed fury. And then comes the masterstroke. As the Austrians struggle to deploy from column into line to meet Desai's infantry attack, Napoleon gives the signal. General Kellerman's 400 heavy cavalrymen mounted on massive horses and armed with long straight swords charge directly into the Austrian flank. The impact is devastating. The Austrian grenadiers, caught in an awkward formation and hit from an unexpected direction, crumble under the cavalry charge. Within minutes, what had been a victorious Austrian army disintegrates into panic. Over 2,000 surrender on the spot, including General Zach himself. The French counterattack spreads across the battlefield like wildfire. Units that had been retreating in defeat just hours earlier are now charging forward, driving the stunned Austrians back toward Marengo and the Bormida River. By nightfall, the battlefield that had witnessed a decisive Austrian victory at 3 o'clock has, by some military miracle, transformed into a decisive French victory by 7. The Austrians retreat in disorder across the Bormida, leaving behind thousands of dead, wounded, and captured. You and Marcel, who hours earlier had been certain you were facing defeat and possibly death, now find yourselves standing victorious on the same ground you'd been forced to abandon. The cost has been terrible, nearly 6,000 French casualties, but the Austrians have lost even more heavily, with 8,000 killed, wounded, or captured. As darkness falls, Napoleon Bonaparte stands triumphant on the battlefield of Marengo. This victory, snatched from the jaws of defeat, will cement his position as first consul of France and pave the way for his eventual coronation as emperor. And as for you and Marcel, you're alive, which is more than can be said for many of your comrades. You're exhausted, hungry, and blood-spattered, but alive. The next morning, the Austrian commander, General Melas, the man who'd been so confident of victory that he'd returned to Alessandria to write his triumphant dispatch, sends negotiators to Napoleon. The armistice he signs will give France control of northern Italy and cement Napoleon's reputation as a military genius. What no one mentions, of course, is how close it had been, how near to total disaster. In later years, Napoleon would rewrite the history of Marengo, downplaying his initial mistake and the role of men like Desailly and Kellerman in salvaging victory. The official narrative would become one of strategic brilliance rather than a desperate comeback. But those who were there, men like you and Marcel, would know the truth, that Marengo wasn't just a victory, it was a miracle. That evening, legend has it that Napoleon, hungry after his near-defeat turned stunning victory, asked his chef to prepare him a meal. The chef, finding little in the way of provisions, cobbled together a dish using a scrawny chicken, tomatoes, garlic, and other ingredients foraged from nearby farms. This improvised dish would become known as chicken Marengo, supposedly one of Napoleon's favourites thereafter. Like many good stories, it's probably not entirely true. Napoleon's chef at the time, a man named Dunand, wasn't even with him at Marengo, and tomatoes weren't common in northern Italian cuisine of the period. But again, why let facts get in the way of a good story? As you sit by a campfire that night, sharing a meagre meal with Marcel and the other survivors, the magnitude of what you've just lived through begins to sink in. You've witnessed one of history's most dramatic battlefield reversals, a defeat transformed into victory through a combination of leadership, courage, and simple luck. The little corporal pulled it off again, Marcel says, gnawing on a piece of bread. Don't know how he does it. But you were there. You saw how close it came to disaster, and you can't help but wonder how many more miracles can one man's luck provide? How many more times can defeat be turned to victory? For now, though, you're simply grateful to be alive as you stretch out on the hard ground, your body aching from the day's exertions. As you drift towards sleep, the sounds of the army settling down for the night surround you, so different from the peaceful quiet of your bedroom back home. Unlike your comfortable modern bed with its soft pillows and warm blankets, tonight you'll sleep on Italian soil beneath the stars, with only a thin blanket between you and the earth. But you'll sleep as victors, not as defeated men, and sometimes that makes all the difference. The morning after Marengo is strangely quiet. Dawn breaks over a landscape transformed by violence. Yesterday, these fields outside Alessandria were green with summer crops. Now they're churned to mud and stained dark with blood. The air carries the metallic tang of gunpowder mixed with something worse, the beginning of decay, as thousands of bodies lie where they fell. You're one of the lucky ones. You survived. Your regiment took heavy casualties, almost 40%, but you and your friend Marcel made it through with nothing worse than exhaustion and a few scrapes. As you pick your way through the battlefield, helping to collect the wounded, the reality of yesterday's miracle victory sinks in. The French soldiers around you move with the hollow-eyed thousand-yard stare that comes after cheating death. Nobody's celebrating. There's too much work to do, too many friends to bury. This is the part they never tell you about in the recruiting speeches, Marcel mutters, helping you carry a wounded man to the field hospital, really just a collection of tents where overworked surgeons labour non-stop, their aprons so soaked with blood they look like butchers. The day after glory. The wounded man between you whimpers as you jolt over uneven ground. He can't be more than 16, a drummer boy caught by Austrian grape shot. His left leg is a mangled mess below the knee. He'll lose the leg, Marcel says quietly, making sure the boy can't hear. If he's lucky, that's all he'll lose. Death doesn't always come quickly on the battlefield. Sometimes it lingers for days as infection sets in. You've seen it before, the slow spread of putrefaction, the fever, the delirium, men begging for water, then begging for death. You reach the hospital tents and surrender your burden to a harried medical orderly. The smell inside is overwhelming: blood, urine, feces, and the sickly sweet odour of gangrene. The sound is worse: moans, screams, and the terrible wet sounds of surgery performed without anaesthesia. "Come on," Marcel says, pulling you away. "Nothing more we can do here." As you walk back toward your regiment's position, you pass a different kind of tent, larger, with guards posted outside. The Emperor's tent. Not that he's Emperor yet. In 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte is still just the first consul of France, technically one of 3 men sharing power. But everyone knows who's really in charge. "They say he slept on the battlefield last night," Marcel tells you, just like he promised. "You believe that?" you ask. Marcel snorts. Maybe, maybe not, but the men believe it, and that's what matters. That's Napoleon's genius. He knows exactly what his soldiers need to hear, what stories will fire their imagination and loyalty. Whether he actually slept on the hard ground or retired to a comfortable bed in a requisitioned villa doesn't matter. The legend is what counts. And speaking of legends, as you pass the command tent, the flap opens and out steps the man himself. It's your first close look at Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's smaller than you expected. Not the tiny figure of later British propaganda, but certainly not imposing. Maybe 5'6", with a pale complexion and dark hair cut short in the Roman style. But his eyes, there's something in those grey-blue eyes that makes you straighten automatically, like a schoolboy caught slouching. He's surrounded by a cluster of officers in brilliant uniforms, a stark contrast to his own simple green coat of a colonel of the Chasseurs à Cheval, his favourite regiment of the Consular Guard. While his generals gleam with gold braid and decorations, Napoleon's only ornament is a small tricolour cockade on his plain bicorn hat. He pauses, surveying the battlefield with those penetrating eyes. Then he notices you and Marcel, 2 common soldiers frozen in mid-step. "From which regiment?" he asks directly, his voice higher than you'd imagined, his accent still carrying traces of his Corsican origins. Marcel snaps to attention. "The 9th Light, Citizen First Consul, Lanz's division. The 9th? You fought well yesterday." Napoleon's gaze moves between you. "Were you present for the final attack?" "Yes, Citizen First Consul," Marcel answers. "We were retreating with the rest when General Desai arrived. We turned and fought." A shadow crosses Napoleon's face at the mention of Desai. A great man. France has lost one of her finest sons. There's genuine emotion in his voice. You've heard that Napoleon and Desai were close friends, comrades from the Egyptian campaign of 1798. Now Desai lies dead, another body cooling on the field of Marengo. "How is the morale in your unit?" Napoleon asks, shifting topics abruptly. Marcel hesitates, and you can see him debating whether to speak the unvarnished truth or a comforting lie. He opts for somewhere in between. The men are tired, Citizen First Consul, and hungry, but proud of yesterday's victory. Napoleon nods, as if this confirms what he already knows. The supply wagons will arrive today. Meanwhile, there will be distributions of captured Austrian provisions. His gaze moves to you. "And you, soldier? Your thoughts?" The question catches you off guard. You're nobody, just one common soldier among thousands. Yet here's Napoleon Bonaparte asking your opinion as if it matters. I think the men would fight better on full stomachs, Citizen First Consul," you manage, immediately regretting your boldness. But Napoleon's mouth quirks in what might be the ghost of a smile. "Indeed, an army marches on its stomach, as I am constantly reminding my quartermasters." He turns to one of his aides. "General Berthier, see to it that food distributions begin immediately, using the Austrian supplies if necessary." "Yes, Citizen First Consul," the aide responds. With a curt nod to you and Marcel, Napoleon continues on his inspection, trailed by his entourage of glittering officers. Holy shit, you breathe once he's out of earshot. Did that just happen? Marcel looks equally stunned. I think we just became part of the legend, and that's how legends grow, one small interaction at a time, spreading through an army of thousands. By nightfall, the story of Napoleon personally ordering food distributions after speaking with common soldiers will have travelled through the entire camp, growing more impressive with each retelling. The reality of those food distributions is somewhat less impressive. Your dinner that evening consists of captured Austrian hardtack rock-hard biscuits designed to last for months without spoiling, softened in brackish water, along with a small portion of salted pork and a ladleful of thin soup. Luxury compared to yesterday's near starvation, but hardly a feast. Still, with full bellies for the first time in days, the mood in the camp improves noticeably. Men who yesterday were too exhausted to do more than collapse into sleep now sit around campfires, talking and even laughing. The horror of battle begins to fade, replaced by the peculiar camaraderie that exists only among those who have faced death together and survived. "You know what's funny?" Marcel says, chewing thoughtfully on his softened hardtack. "I've been in the army 7 years, fought in maybe 20 battles, and I can't remember most of them. They all blur together after a while, but I'll remember Marengo till the day I die." "Because we almost lost?" you ask. He shakes his head. "Because we shouldn't have won. Days like yesterday, they're what separate the truly great generals from the merely good ones. Any officer can win when everything goes according to plan, but to snatch victory from certain defeat, that takes something special." Around your campfire, other soldiers nod in agreement. Despite his mistakes earlier in the day, spreading the army too thin, misreading Austrian intentions, Napoleon had managed to turn catastrophe into triumph in the space of a few hours. If that isn't military genius, what is? As night falls, you find yourself assigned to sentry duty along with Marcel and 2 other men from your company. Your post is near the edge of the camp with a clear view of the darkened battlefield where Austrian torches flicker as they continue collecting their dead and wounded. "Think they'll try again tomorrow?" one of the other sentries asks nervously, a young recruit on his first campaign. Marcel shakes his head. "Not a chance. Their army's broken. Melas will be lucky if he can get his remaining forces across the Po River intact." "So what happens now?" you ask. Marcel shrugs. "The Austrians sue for peace. We get to go home heroes. Bonaparte becomes a little more powerful, and then we wait for the next war to start." "You're a cynical bastard," the 4th sentry laughs. 7 years in Bonaparte's armies will do that to you, Marcel replies, but there's no bitterness in his voice. Despite his cynicism, you know he admires Napoleon. They all do, these veterans who followed him from victory to victory across Italy, Egypt, and now back to Italy again. The night passes slowly. You fight to stay awake, pinching yourself and pacing to keep from nodding off. Falling asleep on sentry duty is punishable by death, though in practice, first offences are usually handled with a brutal flogging instead. Neither option appeals to you. Around midnight, you notice movement on the darkened plain. Tensing, you raise your musket, peering into the gloom, but it's not an Austrian patrol, it's a woman, moving among the bodies with a lantern. "What the hell?" the young recruit whispers. "Who is that?" "Camp follower," Marcel says grimly, "robbing the dead." In every army, there are women who follow the troops' wives, lovers, laundresses, cooks, and yes, scavengers who strip the battlefield of valuables after the fighting ends. It's a grim business, but a profitable one. "Shouldn't we stop her?" you ask. Marcel shrugs. "Why? The dead have no use for coins or rings, and she's probably got children to feed." It's another harsh reality of war that the romantic paintings and heroic poems never mention the desperate ecosystem that springs up around armies. For every soldier in Napoleon's forces, there's at least one civilian whose livelihood depends on the military machine. Sutlers selling food and drink, women washing clothes and tending the sick, craftsmen repairing equipment, and less savoury characters providing gambling, prostitution and other vices. Dawn arrives with a thin drizzle that turns the churned earth to mud. Your sentry duty over, you trudge back to your regiment's position, looking forward to a few hours of sleep before whatever tasks the day brings. But as you approach the camp, you notice unusual activity, officers shouting orders, men forming into columns, supply wagons being loaded. "What's happening?" you ask a passing sergeant. "We're moving out," he answers. "First consul's orders. The whole army's heading east." East? But the Austrians retreated west. The sergeant gives you a look that suggests he's questioning your intelligence. "We're not chasing them, you idiot. We're going to Milan. Word is Bonaparte's negotiating an armistice, but he wants to do it from a position of strength. That means securing northern Italy." This is classic Napoleon never resting, always pushing forward, using momentum to multiply the impact of victory. While other generals might have paused to rest their troops after a battle like Marengo, Bonaparte is already thinking 3 moves ahead, positioning his forces to maximise political leverage. Within hours, the entire French army is on the move, leaving behind burial details to inter the dead of both sides. The rain continues, turning the roads to muddy tracks that suck at your boots with every step. The march is miserable cold, wet, exhausting, but at least you're alive to suffer through it, which is more than can be said for the thousands left behind in the fields of Marengo. Marcel walks beside you, somehow maintaining his usual stoic expression despite the discomfort. "You know what's strange?" he says after several miles of silent trudging. "This campaign's lasted barely a month, but it feels like a year." He's right. It's hard to believe that just weeks ago you were part of the army of reserve assembling at Dijon in eastern France. From there you'd marched to Geneva, then undertaken the gruelling crossing of the Alps via the Great St. Bernard Pass, a feat that military historians would later rank alongside Hannibal's famous crossing 2,000 years earlier. The reality of that crossing had been far less romantic than Jacques-Louis David would later paint it. No rearing charger for Napoleon, who actually rode a sure-footed mule, no dramatic cape billowing in mountain winds, just thousands of men struggling up narrow paths, dragging artillery pieces disassembled and carried in hollowed-out tree trunks, losing fingers to frostbite and comrades to avalanches. After descending into Italy, you'd fought a series of small but sharp engagements as Napoleon manoeuvred to cut the Austrian supply lines. Then came Marengo itself, the battle that had nearly ended in disaster before becoming Bonaparte's latest miracle. And now you're marching again, eastward toward Milan, the capital of Lombardy and the political prize of the campaign. Your feet hurt, your uniform chafes where it's soaked through, and your empty stomach reminds you that the promised supply wagons still haven't fully caught up with the army. But the column's mood is surprisingly upbeat. Victory has a way of making discomfort more bearable. Men sing as they march old revolutionary songs mostly, with a few bawdier tavern tunes mixed in. Officers who might normally crack down on such informality let it pass. After Marengo, the army has earned some latitude. 3 days later, you reach Milan. The city welcomes the French army as liberators, at least officially. Civic leaders who only weeks earlier had pledged loyalty to Austria now proclaim their eternal devotion to France and First Consul Bonaparte. Flags are raised, speeches made, victory parades organised. For common soldiers like you, the city's welcome translates to more practical benefits: real beds in requisitioned housing, decent food, and brief liberty to explore the city's taverns, cafes, and other entertainments. Now this, Marcel says, leaning back in a chair at a small cafe near Milan's magnificent cathedral, is how military campaigns should end. You have to agree. After weeks of hard marching, inadequate rations, and the terror of battle, civilization feels like an impossible luxury. The coffee in your cup is hot and strong, the bread on your plate is fresh, and for the first time in memory, you don't smell of sweat, mud, and gunpowder, having taken advantage of actual bathing facilities at your billet. Enjoy it while it lasts, Marcel advises, taking an appreciative sip of local wine. We'll be marching again before you know it. You think so? I heard the Austrians are negotiating. Marcel nods. They are, but signing papers doesn't mean the war's over. There's still fighting in Germany, and even if peace comes tomorrow, Bonaparte will find another war soon enough. He always does. There's no judgment in Marcel's voice, just the pragmatic assessment of a career soldier who has learned not to hope for long periods of peace. Napoleon's France is a nation perpetually at war, either with foreign enemies or its own counter-revolutionary factions. For men like Marcel, peace would mean unemployment at best, half-pay retirement at worst. As if to punctuate his point, a breathless young officer appears at your table, clearly searching for men from your regiment. "You two 9th Light?" he demands. Marcel straightens. "Yes, Lieutenant. Report to headquarters immediately. Fatigue detail." So much for your afternoon of leisure. Within the hour, you and Marcel are part of a working party unloading supply wagons in the courtyard of the Palazzo Reale, Milan's royal palace, and Napoleon's temporary headquarters. As you labour, the palace buzzes with activity. Couriers come and go, bearing dispatches from other French armies and responses to Austrian peace overtures. Staff officers hurry between meetings, arms full of maps and documents. It's the nerve centre of an empire in the making, though in 1800 few would have predicted how far Napoleon's ambitions would eventually reach. Through an open window, you catch glimpses of the man himself working at a desk piled high